Here's William Lane Craig to explain why he thinks the universe must have been created by a person.
I give 3 reasons for thinking that the first cause reached by the Kalam cosmological argument is personal. Very briefly summarized, number 1 would be that it's the only way to explain an effect with a beginning in time from a permanent, timeless cause.
What is a permanent, timeless cause? If something is timeless, in what sense is it permanent?
If that cause has existed permanently and is truly sufficient for its effect, then the effect should exist permanently as well.
Since the universe is the space-time continuum, any circumstance in which there is time is a circumstance in which there is a universe. The universe isn't permanent in the sense that it has existed for an infinite amount of time, but even if God exists, he isn't permanent in that sense either. God has not existed for an infinite amount of time because there hasn't been an infinite amount of time. So if the cause of the universe is sufficient in the sense that the universe has to exist for as long as that cause has existed, then even if that cause is God, that would in fact be the case. God has not existed for a longer period of time than the space-time continuum has existed, because that would be a contradiction. Craig wants us to believe that the fact that the universe is finite in the past means that the universe began when time began, but that God somehow did not begin when time began. Craig insists that God's existence is causally prior to time, but not temporally prior. That makes no discernible sense to me.
The only way to have a cause that is timeless and permanent.
What would it mean for something to be both timeless and permanent? Permanence is a temporal phenomenon. I have no idea what timeless permanence is supposed to mean. How is that not a contradiction? Similarly, I don't know what it means for God to be both spaceless and omnipresent. How is God able to exist both spacelessly and at all points in space?
And yet for the effect to begin to exist just a few billion years ago is if that cause is a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will.
Well, you know, God himself, if he exists, has not existed for any longer than a few billion years either, because there has not been time for more than a few billion years. So in what sense did the universe begin to exist a few billion years ago, but God did not begin to exist back then? Even if there is a God, if there has only been 13.7 billion years of time, then God has not existed for longer than 13.7 billion years of time. Craig seems to think that if God is permanent, then the universe must exist for an infinite amount of time. But why would that be the case, given that whatever kind of permanence God has is not the kind that means that he has existed for an infinite amount of time? Craig seems to think that God is permanent in some non-temporal sense that is completely inscrutable to me. I could understand the argument if Craig were saying that God has existed for an infinite amount of time, but the universe has not, so when God created the universe, he must have decided to do so. That's not what he's saying, though, because he knows that God has not existed for an infinite amount of time. Given that God has not existed for an infinite amount of time, why would any effect his existence causes have to exist for an infinite amount of time? And why would a cause need to have freedom of the will in order for a spontaneous event to occur? This assumes, first of all, that free will exists, and secondly, that freely willed events are the only kind of spontaneous events. We don't know that decisions are spontaneous rather than determined, and even if they are spontaneous, they would not be the only kind of spontaneous events. So free will would not be necessary to explain a spontaneous event. Additionally, I don't believe that the Big Bang was a spontaneous event. I don't believe that it needs a cause. The Big Bang was simply the earliest moment of the universe's expansion, which has been occurring for as long as time has existed. To infer that this needs a cause seems like Aristotelian thinking to me. Aristotle believed that objects in motion need something to constantly propel them or they will stop. Newton pointed out that objects in motion will stay in motion as long as nothing stops them, just as objects at rest will stay at rest until something moves them. The only time objects in motion need something to propel them is if they were at one time at rest. Since there has never been a time in the 13.7 billion years that time has existed that the universe was at rest, its expansion does not need a source of propulsion. Its existence also does not need, and in fact cannot have, a cause, because you can't cause something to exist at a time when it already exists, and there was never a time that the space-time continuum didn't already exist.
Who can therefore make a choice or execute an action without any prior determining conditions, something that is altogether spontaneous and new.
In other words, God made the universe for no reason whatsoever. Also, free will is not the only phenomenon that can be spontaneous. And also, the universe doesn't need a cause because you can't cause something to exist at a time when it already exists. And there was never a time when the space-time continuum didn't already exist.
The second reason would be that the cause of the origin of the universe must be an immaterial object that transcends time and space.
In other words, it must exist without any of the prerequisites for existence somehow. To say that something exists is to say that it has location in space-time. I have no idea what it would mean to say that something exists if it doesn't exist in some location and at some time. If something is timeless and spaceless, in other words, if it doesn't exist in any place or at any time, then what does it mean to say that it occupies reality at all? Also, how could such an entity carry out any act of creation? How does any such act occur without any time in which to carry it out?
Now, the only things that we know of that could possibly fill that bill would be either an abstract object, like a number. Mathematical objects are immaterial and typically transcend time and space.
No, they don't. Numbers are ideas, and ideas are functions of the brains of any entities that conceive of them.
Or else an unembodied mind or consciousness.
Given that the mind is something that a brain does, I don't understand how a mind can exist without a body. The idea that a mind can exist without a physical body is effectively the idea that a process can occur without anything to carry it out. It's nonsense.
But here's the rub. Abstract objects are causally effete.
Well, yes, things that don't exist have a tendency to be causally effete. Craig defines abstract objects in such a way that they can't sensibly exist at all.
By definition, what makes them abstract is that they have no causal effects, and therefore the cause of the universe cannot be an abstract object.
Nor can it exist at all, given that a space-time continuum is a prerequisite for any act of causation, and therefore cannot have a cause of its own.
And I think that makes it very plausible that the origin of the universe is a personal cause.
Not only is it not probable, it's not even coherent for the universe to have a cause. And it's certainly not coherent for that cause to be a disembodied mind or person, because that is a contradiction as well.
And then finally, the third reason would be that causal explanations are of two types. One would be a scientific explanation in terms of initial conditions and natural laws. The other would be a personal explanation in terms of an agent and his volitions.
The latter is a subset of the former. Volition is a physical phenomenon carried out by brains.
Now, when you think about it, an absolutely first physical state of the universe cannot have a scientific explanation.
Nor does it need one. In fact, it wouldn't make any sense for the universe per se, or its earliest state, to have an explanation in the sense of a cause, because a space-time continuum is a prerequisite for any act of causation to take place.
Because there are no prior initial conditions from which one could extrapolate the first physical state by the laws of nature. And therefore, it follows that the only category of causal explanation that would apply would be a personal explanation. There is a personal agent who, by his free will, brings the universe into being.
How does one carry out the act of bringing something into being without a space-time continuum? Space-time is a prerequisite for any act at all, so it would have to already exist in order for any act of causation to take place. That's why space-time cannot have a cause.
So all three of those arguments coalesce, I think, beautifully to make it, I think, very probable that the cause of the universe is a personal creator endowed with freedom of the will.
Something has to be coherent before it can be probable.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.